Good afternoon. At the heart of spiritual abuse is, I believe, or one thing at the heart of it is abuse of authority or abuse of power to subjugate members in the community. And this practice is sanctioned, one could say baptized, as if it's a holy doctrine in the Lord's Recovery and in some other Christian groups, as one can deduce from the podcast with Julie Roys recently and Lance Ford about heretical submission that I can put in the description of this video a link to. So how was this sanctioned by some Christians? And is it heresy or is it sound doctrine? And what are its implications? I want to talk about that a little bit, and I do want to mention that even the book that I read from yesterday, it has a chapter on culture, and many times cultural practices become sanctioned in a church as if they are something of God, and they're actually very damaging. They harm the church, and this is one of those instances, I believe, that there's extreme damage due to teachings that are actually cultural, but that are definitely dangerous. So let me read. This is from Brother Nigel Tomes' writing, but he has gathered sources, many sources from Christian leaders regarding this matter. And his article is called Living Stream Ministries, Authority and Submission, Tampers with the Trinity. And then the subtitle, Watchman's Eternal Subordination Error. Okay, so I'm just going to read parts, but I will give a link to this in the description of my video, but I've highlighted or underlined certain things that I want to share with you all. The central issue about, there's a certain, in around 2016, there was a very hot debate, and I don't know if it's still going, but a conflict that even Christianity today called a civil war. And it is related to eternal functional subordination of God's Son. And it's in the context of justifying and asserting man's primacy in marriage, family, and church affairs. So this was not, I'm reading Brother Nigel's writing. All of this is reading Brother Nigel's writing. This was not just a storm in a theological teacup. For over a decade, certain prominent theologians sought to ground subordination in human gender roles, man's headship over his wife and family, upon an alleged authority-submission relationship within the eternal Godhead of the Trinity. This attempt to link authority and submission within the Trinity to subordinate gender roles guaranteed that this would be a hot-button issue. Okay, this is relevant to the Living Stream Ministries local church, since their founding father, Watchman, propounded views not significantly different from those of Drs. Ware and Grudem. Okay, their novel teaching, commonly called eternal functional subordination, is also dubbed eternal relationship of authority and submission, and that topic is the theme of Watchman's Authority and Submission, published by the Living Stream Ministry in 1988, which was also entitled Spiritual Authority, as published in 1972. Witness Lee acknowledged Watchman's authority and submission teachings have been misused, saying, "I'm sorry that some Christians utilize Brother Nee's book spiritual authority to make themselves an authority over others. This kind of authority is self-assumed. So Witness Lee has said that making oneself an authority over others is a self-assumed kind of authority, and yet it is practiced and enforced in the local churches. And I'll continue. The emphasis on delegated human authority that Watchman taught was in perfect harmony with Confucian ethics. Okay, so after World War II, Watchman was preaching absolute, even unthinking submission to church leaders, especially himself. So unthinking submission to church leaders, especially himself. Okay, for adherents of this doctrine, it is not a secondary or auxiliary tenet of Trinitarian theology. It is central. This hierarchical structure exists in the eternal Godhead. Some of these ones Dr. Ware asserts. Why is this important? It removes authority and submission issues out of the realm of relativity, where some argue, for example, that the Apostle Paul's attitude toward women's submission reflects first century Greco-Roman cultural norms. And since 21st century cultural norms regarding gender roles are different, some argue that Paul's instructions do not apply throughout all of culture and time. They don't apply today. But the eternal functional subordination doctrine undermines such objections, since it anchors authority and submission issues in the absolutes of the eternal being of the Triune God. Proponents argue that as above, so below relationships in human society ought to reflect what is true in the eternal Trinity. So Watchman similarly exposits Philippians 2, saying, it seems as if there was a conference of the Godhead in the beginning in which a plan was made to create the universe. In this plan, the divine persons of the Godhead agreed with each other and came to the understanding that the Father would be the representation of authority. But if there was only authority without submission, authority could not be established. Hence, there must be submission in the universe. God's foreknowledge foresaw the rebellion of the angels and of man. God's authority cannot be built upon angels or the descendants of Adam. In the Godhead, there was a harmonious decision that authority would be established first within the Godhead. From that time on, there was a distinction in operation of the Father and the Son. One day, the Son willingly emptied himself to become a created man. But in other words, authority and submission existed in eternity, based on this conference of the Godhead in eternity past. Participants in the debate agree that Christ, God's incarnate Son, was submissive and obedient to his Father during his earthly ministry in the economic Trinity. The key issue is whether the Son's subjection is also true in eternity past. To say that would mean that the Son is functionally subordinate in all possible worlds, in all of eternity, and in time. If the Son has this property in every possible world, then the Son necessarily has this property essentially, while the Father does not. So this property of being subordinate. So if the Son has this property essentially and the Father does not, then the Son is of a different essence than the Father. You can't say that eternally, in all of time, in all worlds, in all time, in all eternity, the Son is subordinate to the Father, because that requires some kind of essential difference, which would be heretical. This inevitable implication contradicts the fundamental statement of orthodoxy in the Nicene Creed in 325 AD. Different essences suggest the Father and the Son are different gods, a lesser and a greater God. This is a significant step away from one God in three persons towards multiple gods within a hierarchy. The problem with eternal functional subordination is the fact that it entails tritheism. Okay, so it also implies that there are different wills in the essential Trinity. The Church Fathers link the divine will to the divine nature, since by incarnation the Son has both human and divine natures. As a God-man, he possesses both a human will and a divine will, the latter shared with the Father. Jesus' Gethsemane prayer, not as I will, but as you will, was interpreted to mean not Jesus' human will, but the divine will of both the Father and the Son. Nevertheless, prior to incarnation in the eternal essential Trinity, Orthodox doctrine asserts that the Father and the Son have only one will. There aren't three wills in the divine Trinity. To suggest that the Father and the Son are distinguished by eternal submission and obedience is to suggest that the Father and the Son have different wills. Recognizing the problem, Ridley College theologian Michael Bird writes, there are limits that cannot be transgressed. Functional subordination cannot mean submission of the Son's will to the Father's will within the Godhead, as they have the same divine will. Recognizing one divine will, therefore, undermines the basis for eternal subordination. As Nancy Hedberg says, if you say the Father and the Son have one will and are equal in their essence, their works, and their power, it is slicing things too thinly to then argue that the Son is eternally subordinate in function and authority. Watchman teaches that the Father became head to Christ in the Godhead. Both authority and submission were established by God, present from the beginning. However, in the beginning there was neither judge nor savior. It is hard to conceive, this is, I believe, Nigel's writing, it is hard to conceive of functional subordination in a possible world in which only God exists, in which there's only triune communion of holy love. There's no scope for authoritative Trinitarian roles in eternity past. Also, the scripture mentions love and glory in John 17 within the essential Trinity in eternity. It never mentions authority or submission. There's no causal link or direct connection between Watchman's authority and submission conference in the Godhead and God's economy for the redemption of his elect. Okay, so what we have here is not not a matter of diversity, but of error. Trinitarian error, Mark Jones says. So Watchman attempted to anchor his authority and submission doctrine in the eternal being of the essential Trinity. He presented authority as the overriding attribute of the Trinity. This allowed Watchman to assert that once we touch God's authority, we touch God himself. Meeting God's authority is the same as meeting God. Offending God's authority is the same as offending God himself. A Christian should submit to authority. And then we know that the Bible in the New Testament says that all authority is of God. So basically, to submit to authority is to submit to God himself, and to offend authority is to offend God himself. The Bible never says God is authority. It says God is love, God is light, God is spirit. By inserting authority into the Godhead, Watchman elevated authority above its place in the divine order. This issued in an exaggerated emphasis on authority and submission that characterizes Living Stream Ministries' local churches until today. What does this teaching produce? Watchman described the desired outcome. In order to practice submission, the first thing to ask is, who is above me? Whenever any brother or sister or coworker goes to a place, he or she has to find out who his or her authority is. Moreover, Witness Lee echoes these sentiments. Whenever brothers or sisters are together, each one should keep the order and take his proper place, whether he is above or below others, or on the right or the left. In God's house, there is only the question of God's authority and order. This hierarchical view of God produces a hierarchical church and society. So Watchman and Witness Lee both appeal to Noah's blessing on his two sons, Shem and Japheth, and his curse upon Ham to illustrate submission to God's deputy authority. Watchman asserts Ham's descendants were to be slaves put under others' authority for generation after generation due to exposing Noah's nakedness. Witness Lee says, according to history and geography, Shem, Noah's first son, was the forefather of Hebrews, the Jews, and Ham, his second son, was the forefather of the black people. Ham's son was Cush, the forefather of Ethiopia. Japheth, Noah's third son, was the forefather of the Europeans. Hence, Noah's three sons are identified as the ancestors of three ethnic racial groups, the Jews, the black people, and the Europeans. He then declares, Ham has been cursed. He became a slave of slaves, Has this been proved by history or not? It has. Witness Lee says Ham was the forefather of the black people. Ham has been cursed. He became a slave of slaves. This, Witness Lee says, has been proven by history. Black slavery was the fulfillment of Noah's curse upon Ham. Thus, a hierarchical trinity based on authority and submission is used to justify hierarchical subjugation of blacks. This one example ought to be sufficient to demonstrate that the Living Stream Ministry's dogma of eternal roles of authority and submission in the Trinity is far from innocuous. It is a dangerous doctrine. Those still unconvinced ought to consider the potential for abuse in the doctrine that God's authority is answerable to no one except to God himself. God's deputy authority, they are claiming, is answerable to nobody except God, and that covering of a deputy authority's failings brings blessing. Exposing deputy authority's failings brings a curse, just as Ham was cursed. This is so central in the teaching of a Living Stream ministry in the local churches, and it basically curses anyone who exposes sin that is damaging and stumbling others. They find authority and submission in the Godhead because they wish to justify it in male and female gender roles. Watchman, he does this to justify also hierarchical authority and submission structure in the church. He attempts to ground such hierarchical relationships in the eternal inner life of the essential Trinity. However, the Bible does not do this. These examples suggest that in his era, Watchman Nee fell into the same error, projecting an Asian-style hierarchical structure of authority and submission onto the Triune God. Okay, so now let's go to the Asian cultural concept that was baptized as an eternal Trinitarian principle. China is famously Confucian, Jackson Wu explains. Confucianism is socially hierarchical. All social interactions are regulated by the principle of the subordinate deferring to the superior. Thus, authority is central to ethics, values, and identity. Watchman Nee's authority submission dogma resonates with Chinese Confucian values. Dennis McCallum observed that late in his career, Watchman Nee developed some doctrinal aberrations. These areas had to do with a heavy emphasis on authority and submission. The emphasis on delegated human authority was in perfect harmony with Confucian ethics. Dr. G. Wright Doyle concludes that the Chinese culture encourages authoritarian leadership. He alleges all observers have noted the authoritarian nature of Chinese leadership from imperial times to the present. Jackson Wu agrees that Chinese culture encourages authoritarian leadership and an unwillingness to show weakness. Chinese culture encourages authoritarian leadership and an unwillingness to show weakness, which we see that it pervades Living Stream ministry culture and local church culture that are affiliated with Living Stream ministry. Okay, this raises the specter that Watchman Nee's authority submission dogma was the result of human projection misidentified with divine revelation. Via Watchman Nee's authority and submission dogma, the Asian cultural concept of an authority hierarchy was baptized as an eternal principle of the Triune God. This is heretical. A Chinese cultural or Asian cultural concept becoming an eternal principle of the Triune God in the teachings of Watchman Nee. Yes, styles of worship can be contextualized in cultures, such as Asian style of worship. Okay, but the Triune God cannot be contextualized. Nigel Tomes argues there is neither an Oriental Trinity or an Occidental Trinity. There's one Triune God. There is simply the ontological Trinity. Watchman Nee projected authority onto the Triune God, resulting in an Asian Trinity. Watchmanese authority and submission dogma has been taught for 70 years. It has become a standard tenet of local church teaching and part of Living Stream Ministries' arsenal employed during, quote, turmoils to subjugate the, quote, saints during rebellions. Never in those 7 decades has this doctrine been tabled by the recovery's leadership for evaluation in an open forum allowing for discussion and debate. There has never been an Acts 15 conference on this issue in, quote, the Lord's recovery. Watchman declared that God specifically placed this unique Acts 15 conference in the Bible to be a pattern for solving problems. Nigel writes, but to my knowledge, this pattern has never been applied in the local church. Instead, God's infallible oracle, namely Witness Lee and Living Stream Ministries' blended brothers, present the dogma as a non-negotiable tenet of the local church movement. All challenges to this doctrine or other doctrines are met with stonewalling. Any challenges are called rebellion. As a result, this erroneous and dangerous doctrine remains firmly entrenched in Living Stream Ministries theology. Among Living Stream Ministry local churches, Watchmanese authority submission doctrine, which mirrors the eternal functional subordination dogma, has survived for 7 decades unchallenged, probably more decades now because this was written a while ago. The lack of open discussion among Living Stream Ministries leadership reflects a number of factors. First, local church adherents have been thoroughly indoctrinated with this authority doctrine. Watchman assigned absolute authority to God's deputy authority. They answer to God alone. He taught God appoints authority. Whether or not a deputy authority is wrong is nobody else's business. We have to submit to deputy authority. If a deputy authority makes a mistake, we do not bear responsibility for his mistake. God only requires our obedience. Even if the authority is making a mistake, God only requires our obedience. This is the teaching that covers up abuse. It covers up sin. To challenge a Living Stream Ministry doctrine is perceived as an affront to God's oracle, his deputy authority, which is an act of rebellion. Hence, the doctrine itself puts a severe chill on discussion or debate, even when a teaching like this one is manifestly erroneous and does serious damage. Okay, we see the pervasive influence of Asian culture on the local church. Jackson Wu observes that one of the most important authorities found in Chinese life is the teacher. Education is the acquisition of correct knowledge, not generation of new knowledge in Chinese culture. Hence, the teacher is the repository of knowledge to be passed on to his students. Uniformity rather than individualization is sought. Classrooms are primarily managed through criticism. This is meant to spur diligence and submission to the teacher. In addition, persistence and proficiency in memorization is developed. These Asian values, translated into a Christian context, aptly describe the role of Witness Lee as God's oracle within the, quote, Lord's recovery. This top-down approach leaves no room for theological discussion or debate. 20 years after Witness Lee's departure, his passing away, local church members do not evaluate Witness Lee's teachings. They only memorize and recite them as Witness Lee's tape recorders, which Witness Lee told them to be his tape recorders. Not to evaluate, but just to memorize and recite. Living Stream Ministry publications, affirmation and critique only affirm Witness Lee, never critiques him. Asian cultural norms are pervasive in the local church, even in 21st century North America. I would like to conclude that it's very, very dangerous to have the model of authority and submission attributed even to the Trinity, to the essential relationship of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, and that becoming enforced in Christian circles. And I would like to argue with Nigel Tomes and others that this also is a projecting of Chinese culture into the church, that you have to submit to delegate authority as to God himself. But this is practiced in many, many Christian circles. very ugly, very dangerous, and it's used to cover up abuse and sins.